Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Joseph Torigian. I'm a professor at the School of International Service at American University. Let me begin by thanking Christiana Kastner for helping us prepare for today's event and setting up the webinar. I will turn it over to Professor Joe Young, who is a professor at both SIS and SPA at American University, who will introduce our speaker and run the discussion. Please, Joe.
Thank you, Joseph. We're delighted to have Professor Phil Potter with us today, who's an associate professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Government. Professor Potter had earned his PhD from UCLA, his undergrad degree from McGill. He's also the director of the National Policy Center at University of Virginia. He's one of the rare academics who does outstanding methodologically rigorous research, but also considers the policy and practical implications of his research. And that the director of National Policy Center situation sort of underscores that. He's the co-author of the 2015 book from Princeton University Press entitled War and Democratic Constraints: How the Public Influences Foreign Policy. He's also the author of dozens of peer-reviewed articles in the top journals in IR and political science, such as IO, Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and on and on and on. This is in addition to his government reports and policy papers and more public-facing op-eds that he's done. His research has also been supported by the DoD, by Minerva, the CIA, and by my count is well over $2 million in external funding. So we're grateful to have Phil with us here today. As I mentioned before, I'm a little disappointed that we don't have Phil in person, but we're excited to hear about your project.
Thanks, Joe. Wish I could be there in person as well, but we'll all be together sometime soon. Could whoever's hosting enable screen sharing for me?
I think that's Christiana. Christiana, are you able to do that? Yeah.
Oh, now I'm the host. Even better.
Yeah.
Here we go. All right. There it is. Everybody see that? Okay. So thanks again, Joe, and for the introduction. Very kind of you. And thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you about this. This is a book project with Chen Wang, who's a former PhD student of mine. He's a postdoc at Duke University now. He's amazing. Hire him twice if you can. You know, this is a project that we feel very passionately about and something we've been working on for a really long time. And for the sort of grad students in the audience, you know, I think it's always good to know where these sorts of things come from. This project really was perhaps the world's deepest rabbit hole. So in sort of the 2008, 2009 onward period, I was spending a lot of time in China on other research, writing, giving presentations, that sort of thing. And one of the things I was talking about was a Minerva project that I had, which was mapping cooperative behavior between militant organizations, right? And you give that talk in China, and then immediately somebody pops up and says, hey, what about our militant organizations? And I have to admit, back then, my reaction was, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? You know, I've caught a little bit about disturbances at the Olympics, various other things that have occurred. I have the vaguest notion that something's going on over in Xinjiang and the Uyghur question and these sorts of things, but organizations, not so much, right? That then sort of led to kind of years of inquiry about, you know, what is going on in this situation, both with regard to political violence in China, but even more so with regard to the domestic politics in that country that drive responses. So this is a project that is about political violence in and around Xinjiang, but even more so, it's really about how that interfaces with Chinese politics in ways that lead to the types of outcomes that really surprise us, right? And so a lot of what I'm interested in here and what I'd like to talk to you about is the sort of unmasking some of the seemingly surprising elements to this, all right? So I'll talk for about 20 or 30 minutes and then open it to Q&A. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, which are sort of the top shelf findings from the book. They're going to come fast and furious, and they're sort of there so you have a flavor for what's going on, and then we can go back to any of those that you want to talk about in a little bit more detail. And so kind of going to what I was leading off with, there is this notion that kind of the point of terrorism at a deeper level, point of militancy, point of asymmetric conflict of this sort is to spark outsized reactions. All right. And so, these are pretty well-worn examples, but the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo leads to a series of seemingly inexorable events in World War I and millions dead. Attacks at 9/11, catastrophic in terms of the scale of political violence, right? That was a profoundly successful attack, right? Frankly, when you look at the population and GDP of the United States, it's a pinprick, right? But nonetheless, it shapes global politics for 20 years more, right? We're still living with the consequences of that attack in terms of the way that the reaction of the United States to that incident changed global politics, okay? Forwarding this, China has a legitimate terrorist issue, right? And has for a significant period of time. On the left, you have a photo from an attack at Tiananmen Square. This was a pretty small scale incident, certainly nothing remotely on the order of 9/11, right? But symbolically important. A group takes a car, drives it along the sort of north side of Tiananmen Square, crashes it into one of the imperial bridges. You see something flaming under the iconic picture of Chairman Mao outside the Forbidden City. Obviously something that's sort of a direct challenge and strike to the seat of CCP power, right? On the right-hand side, you see the aftermath of the attack at Kunming. This was a knife attack in a train station, significantly more disruptive and very much challenging to the Chinese psyche, right? So in particular, the ability to project violence out of Xinjiang, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit of length, but the ability to strike soft targets outside Xinjiang and very much challenge the Chinese policy of attempting to keep political unrest bottled up in that region and run what we kind of call a system of two Chinas, a relatively open East where there's a lot of freedom of movement, commerce, that sort of thing, and a much more bottled up West that more closely resembles an authoritarian police state, right? That sort of policy is challenged if militants can get outside of that wire, all right? And then we see this, but nonetheless, as challenging as Kunming was to the Chinese psyche, it's a pretty small scale attack, right? It's pretty low tech. It was interesting to scholars in this area because it was a coordinated attack which we always think of as a hallmark of capability. Sizable group of militants, but attacking with knives, right? They did not appear to be tightly grouped into an organization. The presence of organizations in this struggle is something that kind of comes and goes, but it's not a highly organized environment for political violence, right? But you do get this wildly disproportionate reaction, all right? And this is the sort of thing that then pops into the news in recent years where we see these massive internment camps, right? And so this is a satellite picture of one of these internment camps, and there's been some fantastic work that's been done by others kind of mapping the expansion of the Chinese detention facility infrastructure around this. Estimates vary dramatically, but it's been argued that as many as 2 million Uyghurs have been held in detention out of a total population of about 12, right? So this is a enormous undertaking, okay? And so part of the puzzle here and part of what we want to think through is, how do we understand that extraordinary level of what from a Western perspective strikes us as overreaction, right? How do we understand that overreaction, and how do we avoid miscalculation around that overreaction that can lead to really outsized consequences with global implications? And sort of that's why I led off with this discussion of Sarajevo and of 9/11, right? Because despite the fact that I think a lot of scholars quite rightly focus on the element of this struggle where they say, the behavior of the Chinese state vis-a-vis the Uyghur minority is repressive, it is abusive, it is cultural genocide. All of these things are true, right? But at the same time, it also is the political reality of the situation. And so we have to understand what is driving this, okay? And so that's a lot of what this project is about. And the implications for that are substantial, right? I think people will often kind of forget, at least casually, the part of the world that we're talking about here, right? So you can see China over on the edge there, this picture. You've got a direct border with Afghanistan, which is something that we are paying a lot of attention to these days. Pakistan is just to the south there. This is a complex region with a significant tradition of militancy across borders. And we've seen sort of a lot of potentially volatile situations. Even when the US was still in Afghanistan, Chinese troops were patrolling in the Mekong corridor there, right? Really raising the potential for conflict and an indication of the risk acceptance that the Chinese were willing to undertake in order to try to secure this area, okay? At the same time, there are militant organizations interspersed through this region who are familiar to those of us on this webinar who are kind of working in that broader area, right? That TIP EDM that you see in the middle there is the primary Uyghur militant organization. I hesitate to use that terminology because it sort of comes and goes as an organizational entity. It has at points had operational capacity. More recently, it's been pretty operationally devastated, and it's been much more engaged in rhetoric, trying to inspire attacks, these sorts of things. I sort of guide you toward Sean Roberts' work on this. Roberts talks a lot about the extent to which, is this or is this not organized? Is this or is this not terrorism? And I think those are really important questions to parse. At a larger level, though, in some sense, it's not our call, right? And this kind of goes to the prior point that I was making. The way that the Chinese state is organizing around this and responding to it are going to have implications kind of regardless of the reality of that situation. And so it's sort of, there are two things we need to layer here, and that's part of what this project is about. What is actually occurring? And then what are the domestic political perceptions that are shaping the policies that respond to that reality? And how do we navigate that kind of soupy mess? All right. The point that I'm sort of leading off with here is that problems coming out of this environment, as locked down as it seems currently, would not be black swan events. This is my best attempt at a picture of a gray swan. I think somebody at one point told me that these are juvenile trumpeter swans or something. So for if you learn nothing else from this talk, at least you get that. But this is something that is probably not, it's far from certain that we're going to see a volatile situation coming out of this region and this particular struggle. But it is one of those things in international politics that we should really have an eye on, right? We should be paying attention to this situation because this is a powder keg with an emerging superpower that has implications for the globe. So to sort of orient you around how the book deals with this, the top line puzzle here is why do we see this extreme behavior out of the Chinese state, right? Why are they building these enormous detention centers? Why is there this zero tolerance policy that is the title of the book? What is going on with that? And what can it tell us about intent, right? What can it tell us about what they're worried about in their domestic politics and what it can tell us about intent? And the answer that we come to, which is sort of on one side of a very salient divide in how folks are thinking about Chinese foreign policy right now, is that the CCP is fundamentally cautious, risk-averse, and insecure, and the emphasis being on the last of those. It is not feeling secure. And so again, kind of pointing you to other folks' works, Sinead Greetons and others have talked a lot about the extent to which different elements of insecurity drive assertive foreign policy. Right, and this is an example of that, because unlike how one might sort of in an immediate way think insecurity would drive toward cautiousness, drive toward reservations, drive toward inaction. In this case, it drives the regime to engage in what seem like sort of increasingly extreme behaviors. And this is for reasons that are very familiar to those who work in the politics of autocracies. Particularly sort of mass single-party autocracies like China. The way that militancy is being perceived in this environment is deeply tied up in questions of legitimacy and regime survival. Right? There is a premium after sort of 100 years of humiliation that the CCP be able to sort of portray itself as the locus of stability and control in the country. They have put a lot of capital into the notion that you need us because we are the ones who keep chaos at bay, right? We're the ones who are able to assert control over situations. And we see this again and again, right? So there's a lot in the media just in the last couple of days about China's sort of zero tolerance policy toward COVID, which is increasingly a global outlier, right? That most countries, New Zealand, Australia, have backed away from that and said, okay, this is something we're going to have to live with. It's not realistic that we're going to get this completely in the bottle. China remains in that space, right? And the answer to these questions, I think, despite the vastly different topical areas, is sort of weirdly similar, right? It's because there is this requirement that the state be perceived as a force that can control uncertainty, control chaos, provide that stability. The second element of this, which I think is a little bit more troubling in the immediate term, because this stability aspect has been with us for decades. The part that is more emergent, more dynamic, and causing some of the change that we're seeing in policy in terms of sort of increasingly extreme policies is this emergence of nationalism sort of veering into ethno-nationalism. So folks like Jessica Weiss have talked a fair amount about the extent to which nationalism can be used as a legitimation strategy by the Chinese state. This is particularly important as we move out of a phase where there is sort of unbridled double-digit growth. The lessening of growth changes the social contract. And that's increasingly being replaced with kind of a virulent nationalism, which is very attractive to the CCP, but then that veers into sort of a Han chauvinistic ethno-nationalism. And that's intersecting in really important ways with minority policy, and particularly minority policy toward the Uyghurs. And some of that you see also emerging from the increasing personalization of the state around Xi Jinping, right? So we just have gone through a period where Xi was elevated kind of yet again. He was already by far the most powerful recent leader of China. And that is clearly something that is only on the increase rather than the decrease. The end result of that is that the prestige of the state is increasingly caught up in an individual, and time horizons shorten, right? So the nature of the state becomes one where short-term instability is more intolerable, right? Short-term knocks to prestige are more intolerable. They're not playing the long game to the extent that they were, right? So the implications of this are effectively zero tolerance for political violence domestically, right? So the interpretation of, hey, this is a small-scale, low-tech attack driven by grievances among a minority. They are not organized, not deeply relevant for the fact that there is no tolerance coming out of these domestic constraints that they have, right? Even very small incidents are a challenge to the authority of the state, okay? The result of that, are sort of multiple. One of those is very tight control of information unless conditions are ideal, okay? And limited regional exposure unless the needs are really high and the risk is low, right? So what I'm driving at here is this notion that what we're thinking is happening is a set of policies that are driven by conservatism, right? Extreme overreaction in terms of domestic security, overinvestment to the point of spending unaffordable amounts of money, right? Excessive information control that erodes the legitimacy of the state in the longer term, but is seen as necessary for managing this particular threat in the short term. Suboptimal foreign policies that engage in joint counterterrorism exercises, which I'll show you a little bit on later on, that are not really set up well for kind of engaging with the region in a coherent, cohesive way over decades, but is much more sort of immediately responsive to the presence of Chinese FDI and threats. So the way this kind of then plays out in the book, we go through and we talk a bit about the scope of violence. One of the key things that's been missing from this conversation is sort of a coherent sense of what has actually occurred historically in terms of events. And so there's a sort of substantial data collection effort involved in identifying the various incidents of violence that have occurred. We dig into the sensitivity to that violence in terms of what official media can tell us about official priorities, and particularly this question of sort of how responsive are the authorities to the requirement that they discuss and acknowledge and provide information about attacks. And the takeaway there is there's sort of this consistent favoritism towards stability over legitimacy, right? We then look at the domestic policy response in terms of spending on these internment camps and various other policing mechanisms that have emerged over the preceding decades. And then we look at the foreign policy response in terms of these joint counterterrorism exercises that I was alluding to before. All right. So what I'm going to do then, as I said, is I'm going to walk you through what this actually looks like, just so you have a sense of sort of how these numbers play out and have a sense of kind of what we can talk about. But then I am going to kind of bow out and open it up to Q&A, because I think that's probably the most interesting part of this conversation, because this is a really kind of pressing issue, I think, for a lot of folks. All right, so taking sort of the roughest view of this, a colleague of mine recently referred to this with a sort of political science jargon bit that I enjoy, which is model-free evidence. And so this is that, right? So here's a bar chart of the incidence of Uyghur-initiated political violence over time, all right? We're looking here at those divided by year, and then also whether there's a civilian target or a government target, all right? One thing I should say in passing is throughout this volume, we really we try to pay an awful lot of attention to this question of sort of avoiding working our way into Chinese propaganda on this stuff. All right, so a lot of terrorism scholars for a long time have sort of stopped calling themselves terrorism scholars. They're scholars of political violence. They look at organizations, they look at events, they look at militancy. Obviously, the word terrorism is incredibly value laden. And so we really try to take an analytical picture of this and kind of stay out of that whole situation. Sensitive to a lot of the points that have been brought up by Roberts and others in terms of the way this is portrayed by the state, right? And so these are violent incidents, and that's why in particular we're dividing this by civilian target and government target, right? We're remaining relatively agnostic on, hey, how do we parse which of these are terrorist incidents and which of these are not terrorist incidents? We're just letting the data talk on that, okay? And happy to talk more about how we think about that particular issue. It's something we've given an awful lot of thought to, and frankly, it's sort of the real challenge of this whole project is how to take a sort of analytical perspective on something that is so sort of emotionally and morally fraught. All right, and so similar story here with weapons and tactics. You see that same wave that's occurring. So you basically get three waves here, and we talk about these in the book. You have this early wave, which is effectively rising expectations coming out of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So this is a region where ethnic brethren in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and various other places are gaining their independence, right? Looking at the fall of the mighty Soviet Union and the relative weakness of China in this period, folks in the region, I think, quite reasonably assumed that they were next, right? And so there's this sort of rising tide of Uyghur nationalism showing up in that period and increasing incidents around that. As we kind of talk about in the book, there's a lot of variation in the nature of the political contestation that's going on in these waves. It goes from sort of, there are different points, it's much more in terms of mass protests, riots, these sorts of things. And then a little bit later on, once the state kind of cracks down on that, the mass component of it goes away and you're left with the more militant hard edge of it. Again, it dovetails very, very well with the understanding we have from Erica Chenoweth and other people like that who talk about the sort of various elements of kind of mass versus militant movements. But you have that first wave coming out of the 90s. You have another little bump around 2008 with regard to the Olympics, right? And really interesting dynamics there in terms of the ability of militants to time violence according to external incentives, essentially, right? Knowing that the world is looking and being able to take advantage of that window is, I think, indicative of certain reserves of capability as well as sort of broader sensitivities towards how the nature of the violence is going to be perceived both domestically and internationally. And then you have this huge uptick in violence that happens up through 2014. This then is followed by really, really harsh reprisals. Okay, and so you have a couple things going on here. You have Xi Jinping really locking in and rising to power. You have significant changes in policy in Xinjiang. The end result is sort of at that 2014 break. You have one of the harshest sort of CT interventions that we've seen globally and the emergence of these camps and the total fall off in violence. But the real question is what happens if that is relaxed. And one of the things we kind of end up with at the end of the book is that in a lot of ways, those policies were unsustainable, both in terms of domestic expenditure and in terms of international outcry, including some domestic outcry as well. People within China saying like, hey, this is not how we want to be doing business. And so as they dial back pressure, what is that going to mean? I think is one of the key things to think about. In the information environment, right, what we looked at, as I sort of alluded to previously, was the time to reporting of militant incidents in official media, right? So how long does it take the official media to acknowledge? And there are some reasons why, I think key to this logic is there's pretty good reasons why you might want to acknowledge a violent incident, right? One of these is sort of the point that Roberts and others have gotten to, that the CCP went to great pains to paint the issues they were having in Xinjiang in terms of international terrorism, right? Painting it in terms of sort of the global war on terror, so to speak. And so in order to make that work, you're going to want to, make it clear internationally that these things are occurring and put your own framing on it, right? At the same time, there's tremendous pressure within China to start thinking seriously about information legitimacy, right? One thing that kind of gets bandied around in Chinese policy circles is this idea of sort of a Tacitus trap, which is, this notion that once you sort of lie too much, then nothing you say, no matter how true it is perceived as correct, right? And so this kind of information legitimacy around high salience events and terrorism being a very high salience, militancy of any kind being a very, very high salience situation is something they're obviously going to be thinking about. What we're finding, though, and sort of what we were expecting to find, is that only when conditions are really optimal is the CCP willing to kind of follow those pathways. So only when the international diplomatic environment is relatively benign to China, they're getting a lot of support for their initiatives globally. Only when domestic conditions measured in terms of things like economic growth are feeling really good, are they willing to invest in that long-term transparency, right? When other conditions hold, when anything's challenging about their international or their domestic environment, there's much more of a conservative tendency to hold back, right? And so this really kind of underlines that conservatism that I'm getting at here. And you can see that here. This is a survival model of the probability of non-reporting. And you can see that basically the only time that they're reporting with any frequency is when that sort of dual set of conditions holds, right? International conditions are good and domestic conditions are good. And then they're putting it out there in the People's Daily. Otherwise, they're really delaying as much as they possibly can acknowledging events. That says the same thing, essentially. So with regard to investment in securitization, right? Others have done more expansive work on this, Liebold and folks like that. But we took sort of a deep dive at trying to understand where investments have been made in domestic securitization, this sort of zero tolerance policy, and what the implications of that have been. And one thing that sort of no matter how you measure it, that just pops out again and again and again, is the extent to which the investments that have been made in Xinjiang in terms of security, public security expenditures, expenditures as a ratio of GDP, it sort of doesn't matter how you slice it. The thing you should be taking away from this picture is just that very sort of blaring dark color up in the Northwest, right? The investments have been dramatic. And I think, from a US perspective, we often will get into a position where we're so accustomed to talking about the financial rise of China that we tend to forget that this remains sort of a middle income country with a lot of different competing economic priorities. And the level of investment that is coming here it comes with significant opportunity costs, right? It comes with opportunity costs in terms of economic investment, right? It also comes with security economic costs, right? So if this is the part of the country that's becoming militarized and policed, and we go in a little bit in terms of sort of the extent to which this is PLA, PPA, various security elements of the Chinese state. But the way this works, there's a set pie there, frankly. And so this is money that's not going to contest the South China Sea, right, or to do various other things. And so this is an indication of really important prioritization. One of the things that that information let us do in conjunction with the information that we had before is think about sort of this cycle of violence and repression that's been going on in the region for 30 years, right? And so these are the results of sort of a series of vector autoregressive models where we're kind of thinking about, hey, what does a surge in militant violence lead to in terms of spending on the left here? And you can see there is this sort of immediate uptick in terms of spending. And we know this, right? After every sort of significant wave that we saw in those bar charts with the model-free evidence, right? There's been what's called a strike hard campaign, right? Where there's just this sort of flood the zone in terms of security. What's interesting is after that, once there's a surge in investment, what that does is, and this is the right-hand side in the story of that picture, it initially drives violence down, right? Which is unsurprising, right? If you're gonna sort of put a dragnet on the region, police on every street, that's gonna drive violence down. It then is associated with a bit of an uptick, right? And this kind of gets us to a large part of this story, which is that there's a very cyclical element to what's going on here, where you have sort of, you have violence, the CCP reacts to that violence with repression, that leads to short-term stability, the costs of that repression mount, controls are loosened, and it all kind of goes around and around again with sort of these deeper unaddressed grievances at the core, right? And that sort of endless cycle, I think, has been one that has been, the state has been able to paper over because they have been able to spend increasingly large sums of money. But one of the folks we interviewed in China for this, described it in terms of keeping your hand on a kettle, right? You can sort of hold the steam in for a while, but it doesn't make it go away, right? At a certain point, you're facing a fairly explosive situation. The last thing we sort of look at is regional relations, right? And to me, this is one of the things I want to kind of keep working on once the book is out. And I think one of the more interesting components of the whole story. So we're all pretty familiar with this Belt and Road initiative, right? This comes up a little bit. We talk quite a lot about the extent to which China is investing across Central Asia, among other places. But for the purpose of this project, Central Asia being kind of the key part of this. And this is obviously a politically complex region from the standpoint of militancy, right? As I kind of opened the talk with, that's a complicated map coming out of Xinjiang, which they have explicitly discussed as sort of their on-ramp to this new Silk Road, right? And so as part of that, China has sort of stepped out in a significant way with joint counterterrorism exercises, right? So they're doing a lot of international training with regard to joint counterterrorism exercises. And particularly after 2001, where there really is this kind of sea shift in terms of Chinese policy. And what we explored was sort of, well, what helps us understand the variation in a picture like this, right? Where there are some countries with whom there is a great deal of interaction on this dimension, and some countries where there is not. And part of the story here is that this is a key mechanism that China is using to step out militarily on the global stage, right? And so it's something that we care a lot about in its own right, aside from what it kind of tells us about priorities with regard to militancy. And so here's what you sort of see coming out of that. This is the story that we're telling there is that China is actually not investing based so much on its foreign policy objectives in a grander sense. It's making very targeted engagements where they are doing exercises with countries where there is significant Chinese investment, right? They have stuff on the ground that's vulnerable to militancy, right? And so they're very concerned about the externalization of this threat. Once they've locked down Xinjiang, then their assets abroad become more vulnerable, right? So they're concerned about those assets. And then they only even bother to do it then if that country has a militancy problem, right? So they don't want to create a militancy problem where one doesn't exist, and they don't want to invest in an existing militancy problem where they don't have skin in the game, okay? And so it's this very selective engagement. And you can sort of see that here, right? So we've got FDI on the bottom and the marginal effect of terrorist attacks. And so if you're in a situation where there is very low Chinese investment in the country, right, then terrorist incidents within that country actually drive down the probability that China is going to do joint exercises with you, right? They're less likely to do it. So like, we don't want any part of your problem, right? If you go out to the other side of that, where there's significant investment, then it's the other way around, right? And then sort of driving home the extent to which that is sort of driven by the mechanism that I'm laying out here, it's really about those domestic incidents inside that country. And so again, China is showing a real unwillingness to tangle with these international organizations that are oriented toward transnational violence, right? And I think that's super interesting given the extent to which China has consistently sort of played defense against getting identified as a status quo power that's sort of on par with the US as the kind of country you'd want to be striking, right? And different organizations, militant organizations, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, have at various points in time in their literature sort of said like, hey, the Chinese are being pretty terrible. Maybe we should be thinking pretty seriously about them. And that's never quite stuck. And so clearly China is sort of trying to play this measured game to avoid that kind of blowback. And so in conclusion, what I'm seeing here, what we're seeing here is that, insecurity is the sort of broader theme behind a lot of CCP policy in this area. This is not a regime that's feeling particularly good about its position. And that's a lot of why we understand what's happening, what we think sort of explains it. At the same time, insecure autocracies are a major risk, right? They present huge risks for miscalculation because the stakes that they see in certain situations are often not transparent to democratic counterparts, right? And so I think there really is that potential for parties to misunderstand how China is likely to react to, again, what seems like an entirely tolerable and acceptable sort of small scale incident, right? And so all of that sort of leads to this main conclusion, which is, this is, I think, despite the fact that we've been paying more attention with regard to internment camps and things like that, this remains a broadly sort of understudied and misunderstood situation. And it's one that I think we should be paying a little bit more attention to. So let me turn the floor back over to you, Joe, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Well, thanks, Phil, for an excellent presentation. You remember, folks, you can ask questions in the Q&A and I'll field them. But I'll take a little prerogative first and ask you a question just as we sort of warm things up. And, as you mentioned, and as I know you're an expert in political violence, not China per se. And I wonder if you could talk about, and you do a lot of this in the book, so I think it's useful just to bring out here a little bit about what you bring to this conversation as an expert in political violence that maybe is missed if we were just talking among experts on China.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about this from a political violence standpoint, and Chen is sort of more of an expert in China, and so that is one of the joys of co-authorship is you can divide and conquer a little bit. One of the things I found sort of remarkable about this was the extent to which the Chinese case, as outliery as it seems kind of on first inspection, once you kind of peel it back, fits pretty closely with our understanding of political violence and autocracies. And your sort of top shelf stuff coming out of Piazza's work and others, with regard to the sort of effectiveness of repression in that context, right? These are states that especially if they're as wealthy as China is, that can repress at a level that really can subdue violence when they want to make that happen, right? The way I describe it in the book is that the levels of repression that China's employing are what North Korea would do if it could afford it, right? And so that you can really see them with this capacity to toggle on and off the violence, right? Same thing on the information side. We know about autocratic advantages coming out of a whole body of work in terms of sort of depriving what Thatcher called the oxygen of publicity, right? Like democracies are terrible at this. As soon as there's something bad happens, it's wall-to-wall coverage on the news. It's, and then you see policymakers sort of lament this and try to say like, hey, public, remember rare events. And like, when bombs are going off, publics don't remember rare events, right? And so again, you sort of see that advantage and you see China playing with that advantage in ways that are interesting. Where I think, China, again, sort of matching with the literature struggles is with regard to accommodation. Right. And this, again, is sort of a truism in the political violence literature that, and particularly the sort of political violence literature that grapples with regime type. This is just what autocracies are bad at. They're not great at this stuff. And where I think China gets interesting is it challenges us to think about some of the mechanisms there. right? So particularly as the country sort of moves from, being a very single party-ish to being a little more personalistic, we're seeing some variation in that autocratic regime type. Some of those capabilities and willingnesses are moving for us. And I think that allows us to kind of interrogate what's going on in that literature. But for me, the really interesting and surprising part was how predictable China was from a how we talk about the political violence literature.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you talked about those mechanisms to sort of explain your argument. And I found your argument persuasive, but I felt like one of the mechanisms that you discussed briefly, but don't go into depth a lot about, but this is more in the general political violence literature, is that of reputation, right? China has multiple domestic actors it's concerned about. So, one of the things that just popped into my head as I was reading is like, this is really just about creating your domestic reputation. And so you're going to respond regardless of kind of international pressures. So why do you sort of downplay there? Why is that not sort of central to the story?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it should be more central, because certainly when you say that, I want to lay claim to that. I'm like, yeah, no, that I definitely think that, right? And so perhaps that's something that needs a little bit of a tweak somewhere along the way, because and this is what I mean when I talk about miscalculation, right? I often think the foreign policy literature is sort of full of this, but this notion that countries routinely look at their own domestic politics as complicated and the domestic politics of others as simple, right? And at the same time, we sort of know that the vast majority of what drives actual foreign policy decision-making is domestic politics, is not foreign policy expediency. And I think, again, that truism holds here, that the CCP is deeply worried about regime security, right? And so the end result is that, where you call it reputation, I think we're much more inclined to sort of talk about it in terms of legitimacy, right? That they have the sort of the consent of the governed in some key regard, at least up to the point where they are willing to compel the remainder. And so that to me is what's driving an awful lot of that effect.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good to hear. And we have a question from Shane, who's curious about how you measure the Chinese government's insecurity or perception of insecurity, and future insecurity in general.
Yeah, so I would say that it's not measured directly, right? So that I think we are able to dig up quite a lot in terms of sort of quotes, things that have kind of come out of Politburo meetings and things along those lines. The book is sort of peppered with officials kind of saying things that lead us to think that this mechanism is holding true. Empirically speaking, an awful lot of what we are using to identify that are secondary implications, right? That, hey, there are incentives to be transparent. Here they are, and they're talked about in the literature, but the policy statements, and yet we only see them do that when they're facing almost zero risk, right? So they're extremely risk intolerant, and so there's definitely a task of kind of inference there, partially because it's twofold. One, it's not the kind of thing policymakers tend to articulate, even if you do have access to the archives, and in this case, it's a pretty closed book.
Yeah, I want to get back to the notion of miscalculation that you brought up earlier, which was fascinating to me, both from China's miscalculations and then also the Uyghurs' miscalculations. And I wonder, the hypothetical, if you were advising the Uyghur resistance about the appropriate way to respond to this massive repressive infrastructure and still sort of get the things they wanted, like what sorts of advice would you give them, and in what ways are they playing into the Chinese hands?
I don't know that they are, right? This is an incredibly challenging situation for that population, right? So among other things, there's very little evidence of any kind of organized resistance. There's no civil society of any kind. There's no belly button here inside of Xinjiang, right? And so you do have kind of a pretty vibrant Uyghur diaspora movement, right? And that is, it exists in a variety of places. It's traditionally been sort of centered in Turkey. There's some of it in Canada. There's a few other places where this exists. There's some group, people active in the US as well. It's not well organized, right? It's as a lot of these diaspora groups are, it's very fractious. It doesn't have tentacles, as far as I know, at least, into Xinjiang in a meaningful way, in part because of the amount of risk that that entails for anybody on the opposite end of that, right? And so, I think the efforts that have been underway that are largely about sort of shining a light on this situation, creating uncomfortable situations for China over this, raising costs, are probably, they're not going to win the day, but they're probably the best that can be done under these circumstances. In reverse, though, China is out there really actively strong-arming a lot of these countries that have weaker populations in them, right? And so they're, coming out of some of the events in the 90s, a lot of Uyghurs moved over into Kazakhstan before eventually kind of moving on to other places. But, as China's ability to extend its region has increased, the places that are local and are, there's space to operate are pretty few and far between. And, we're even seeing this now with Afghanistan. There, as soon as the US kind of vacated that space, the Chinese were immediately in there. And one thing that's very, really common concern inside of the diaspora conversation is that, China is going to bail Afghanistan out, right? They're going to give them the cash, but there are going to be contingencies there. There are going to be strings attached. And one of those may well be, crack down on this Uyghur population that is in Afghanistan, largely minding its own business. There's that, to the extent that there is militancy, a lot of it's there, but the vast majority of the people who are there are just trying to live their lives. And so some concern that there's going to be crackdown combined with repatriation, right? And obviously that's a pretty harrowing situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as China's become a more dominant rising force in international relations. It's whether that's a consequence of their own choice or whether that's because the US has been sort of pulling back, it does raise the question of like, what is their guiding foundations in these sorts of interactions in the international system, right? And it seems like from what you have in the book and what you've said here, it's a lot of it's money related, right? I mean, is that the guiding motivation essentially
for the region?
Yeah,
I think so. And combined with so a lot of it's money, and as we know, China is not super shy about putting the contingencies on money that it wants to put on them, right? Very different perspective in terms of what is an acceptable conditionality. And I think behind that is an increasing concern about Chinese capability. Right. So one of the things we kind of talk about with regard to the military exercises is that's also a way to provide that element of the PLA with training, with capability, but also to demonstrate that capability in the near region. Right. And so it's very hard to know how those things are balancing out, but I don't think it's all carrots. I think there's a little bit of a stick back there as well.
So we have another question from the audience from Anissa, and she would like us to touch upon the implications of Uyghurs' repression for Central Asian countries, given the regional proximity and legal interaction through Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And she puts in parentheses here that she's doing a master's thesis on this, so that could be super helpful to her.
Yeah, happy to talk in addition, if you ever want to reach out. The SCO has been sort of the backbone of this for a long time. So at this point, it's been sort of superseded by other organizations and relationships, but it remains sort of lurking back there as the backbone of sort of engagement on this topic. And it's important that the SCO's charter was set up around these sort of three evils of separatism, extremism, terrorism, right? So this has been sort of the logic the whole time. And so the regional relations around that have been, there's a significant kind of compellent edge to what's going on here, right? But combined with the notion that you need to cooperate with us on this dimension of sort of militant violence, which China reads as Uyghur violence, if you want to engage with us economically. The implications for the broader population, I think, are profound, right? So as I've mentioned, this is a really close ethnic group to particularly the Kazakhs, but Tajiks and others. These are folks whose languages are pretty close, and minor work getting over that divide. much, much closer, obviously, than the linkage between the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese. And so there is this sort of, I think, attempted cleavage that the Chinese state is trying to sort of put in. And you see it most explicitly in Kazakhstan, where there's this attempt to sort of like get the Uyghur population in Kazakhstan out from being sort of fully melded into the Kazakh population. And part of that is this, when I was talking about that two Chinas logic, right? I think there's sort of a logical fallacy baked into Chinese policy, which is this notion that you can sort of bottle up this problem and sort of cordon it off from your core economic enterprises, right? And your core policy enterprises. And what that does is it just incentivizes any sort of political activity up to militancy to project outside of that cordon, right? Where you're going to get much, much more outsized effects. And so within that within that context, it means, don't strike in Xinjiang. Nobody's going to hear about it, right? And they've set up a policy where explicit policy is to be able to have police to any urban corner within 1 minute, right? So like, no one's going to hear about it. If you get it over to Kunming or you get it over to Tiananmen Square, then very different story. Same thing in the region, right? I think there's this increasing incentive for that militancy to manifest itself in the region against Chinese nationals. There's a real tendency to sort of man these Belt and Road projects with Chinese nationals doing the jobs, right? And so it's Chinese money, it's Chinese people, on the ground in some of the most contested space on the globe, right? And so I think that that's sort of a further challenge to the region. And then the last thing I'll say about this is this topic of sort of digital authoritarianism that a lot of folks have been talking about. I'm not a specialist in this area, but the extent to which Chinese sort of capability with regard to surveillance, with regard to repression around facial recognition, cameras, or how you do block by block policing, these sorts of things are starting to show up in these other countries in the immediate region. And the SCO and other organizations are sort of a vector of transmission in that regard. And again, there is a bit of a compellant edge there. It's not that these countries are necessarily, sometimes this is technology that they want. In other cases, it's a little bit more that the Chinese are saying, hey, this is something you really need to be doing if you want to be kind of part of our bloc. And the reason for that goes to this two Chinas thing, right? That, our problem is metastasizing outward, and therefore our repression needs to metastasize with it.
So I know we were talking before the meeting, and Joseph had a question. Joseph, do you want to bring it up here?
Yeah, I'm curious. So I have looked at PRC policies in Xinjiang from about 1945 to the early 90s, primarily because of the role that Xi Jinping's father played managing the Uyghurs, especially during the 1980s. And what's interesting about the 1980s is that at first there was a recognition in Beijing that the Cultural Revolution had been an absolute disaster, and that to stabilize the situation, the right answer was to recognize that they had made mistakes, address grievances, promote local cadres, give greater freedoms, allow more religious space. In fact, there's a quote that is very interesting by Xi Zhongchun himself, where he says that the more we tighten the screws, the more that people are interested in religion as a way of resisting, and also goes outside of our control. And then throughout the 1980s, for very complicated reasons, both in Tibet, which had a big impact on Xinjiang, but in Xinjiang too, there were these disturbances. And for a lot of the 1980s, there were people in Beijing who were powerful enough to make the case successfully that these were contradictions among the people, and that ultimately these issues can be addressed by empowering local so-called democratic percentages, which is a phrase meaning just people with cachet there that can be used as bridges and go-betweens, right? But by 1989, 1990, that case was no longer tenable. And we can debate whether or not whether that was the right judgment or not, but it raises this issue of like cycles and how they work, of this tightening the screws and loosening the screws. And I guess what somebody in Beijing might say to you is, well, we tried loosening our policies in the 1980s, and what happened was people weren't happy we were addressing their grievances. They used that open space to hurt us and to cause trouble. Now, it seems to me that the extent of the persecution of the Uyghurs raises serious questions about what's going on with the sense of grievance, right? And it strikes me that it might even create a stronger fear that if they loosen, that it would be just something that they couldn't control. So, like, what would be the out then? Like, you're saying that these policies are a mistake because they're overreacting and they're spending too much money. But to play as devil's advocate, how would you react to someone who said, well, we tried loosening things in the 1980s, we've really tightened things up this time, probably really created some grievances this time? Like, how do you walk back from that? Exactly.
Yeah, so I don't think there's an easy way to walk it back, right? Because what I would say is the current policy seems to be that you can erase the culture, right? And so the notion would be that you could do something in Xinjiang that's more akin to what you did in, so think about Native Americans in the US, right? Where you have sort of such a substantial preponderance that you just kind of erase the culture except for a tiny remnant, right? I think, the Tibet example weighs very, very large in the Chinese mind on this, because they're seen as sort of parallel things. As you noted, the recent crackdowns in Xinjiang have been driven in large part by bringing over the architects of very similar policies in Tibet, right? I'd again say very different, right? So there you have, maybe 6 million Tibetans hemmed in by a mountain range, right? They're, not just any mountain range either. Here you have more like 12 million Uyghurs up against their ethnic brethren in Central Asia. I just don't really see erasure as a viable option, right? And so, I think the answer is probably that you have to be tolerant of those pain points that you were describing before. And I think the difference is in the 80s, kind of coming out of the Maoist period, Deng Xiaoping, you have this sort of opening up. People are saying, oh, this is kind of working pretty well. We're secure enough in our rule that we're willing to tolerate some contestation, right? And you see this at other points in Chinese politics too, where we're gonna be relatively tolerant of village level protest, right? We don't really care if some Han Chinese farmers occupy a village square and say, like, down with the corrupt people who are seizing our land. We're gonna be tolerant of that. And then at other points where that tolerance is gone. In the 1980s case, I think it was the fall of the Soviet Union and then Tiananmen and various other things that led to like, oh, wow, we are in trouble here. Regime security, this is not okay anymore. Tighten it up, right? You saw subsequent openings after that too, where there was willingness to accommodate, and at different points things got out of hand. And then these sort of strike hard campaigns. And so, I think the answer is you have to be in a place where you can tolerate that risk. Do I think the Chinese are in that place now? No, I don't. So I don't really see this as a prescriptive project for Chinese policy, right? It's much more sort of this is kind of bad, which is not the most uplifting thing in the world. But at one point the book was titled sort of No Way Out, right? Which is like, there's just not an easy way off of this situation, right? And I think that's where we are at this moment, and particularly as the regime shifts and molds in ways that make it structurally intolerant of bearing those costs. I think the points that you're raising are really sound. I don't see what they're going to be able to do. So my instinct is that they're going to keep trying to do versions of what they were doing, not so much at the height of the camps, right? But sort of 2015-16 version on steroids, where you're doing very, very heavy surveillance of the population, pretty heavy interventions in terms of promotion of interethnic marriage, in terms of promotion of Mandarin education, not allowing Uyghur to be taught in schools. Do I think that will erase Uyghur identity? Not really. No, I don't think so. But that will be the locus of significant Chinese investment.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Potter, for a fascinating conversation and presentation. I think the final question we need an answer to is, when is the book coming out and where is it coming out?
So
I
it's
would get it.
with Cambridge, and I think maybe about 8 months is the word on the street.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody else for coming too, and thanks for the excellent questions. And we appreciate it.
I really appreciate you having me. This was fantastic, and thanks for the excellent questions and the opportunity to present the work.